Hey everyone, quick note before we start. This episode covers the murders of children and young men, police failure, and child exploitation. We'll handle it with care, but we want you to know what you're walking into.
Take care of yourselves. If you need to sit this one out, we'll be here next week.
Okay. Dylan, you've heard of John Wayne Gacy, right?
Last week's episode, yes. Chicago, the clown, 33 victims.
Right. Now, have you heard of Dean Corll?
I don't think so.
Most people haven't, which is exactly why we're covering him today, because Dean Corll murdered at least 28 boys and young men in Houston, Texas, between 1970 and 1973. More victims than Gacy, more victims than Ted Bundy, and he is a fraction of the household name that either of them are.
How is that possible?
That is the question this entire episode is going to try to answer. Welcome back to HILLarious Media. I'm Cindy.
I'm Dylan, and today we're going somewhere that true crime coverage has largely overlooked, and we're going to talk about why it has.
To understand this case, you have to understand the Houston Heights in the early 1970s. It's a working-class neighborhood on the north side of Houston. In its heyday, it was a tight-knit community, the kind of place where everybody knew everybody, kids ran around outside until dark, and doors were left unlocked.
Sounds idyllic.
It had been, but by the early 70s, the neighborhood was struggling. Economic decline, families moving out, a general sense of things falling apart. And into this community, Dean Corll was a fixture.
Who was he?
Dean Corll was born in 1939 in Fort Wayne, Indiana. His family eventually settled in Houston, where his mother ran a candy company, the Corll Candy Company. Dean worked there and was known throughout the Heights for giving free candy to neighborhood kids. He was 31 years old and handing out candy to children, and everyone thought that was lovely and normal.
That is, in retrospect.
In retrospect, it is a very loud alarm bell, but at the time he was just the candy man, generous, quiet, a bit odd maybe, but fundamentally harmless seeming.
Did he have any prior record?
No criminal record. He had served briefly in the Army, worked at the candy factory, and by the early 1970s was working as an electrician for Houston Power and Light. Stable job, known face in the community, nothing that would have flagged him.
And he starts killing in 1970.
His first known victim was in 1970, but what makes Corll different from most serial killers, and what makes him especially chilling, is that he didn't work alone.
Tell me about the accomplices, because this is the part of the case that I find most difficult to process.
It is genuinely complex. David Brooks was around 14 when Corll first recruited him. Elmer Wayne Henley was around 15. Both were from the Heights, both were from struggling families. Both were exactly the kind of teenager that a predatory adult could exploit. Kids who needed money, attention, somewhere to go.
And Corll provided all of those things.
He groomed them. There's no other word for it. He gave them money, a place to hang out, access to alcohol and drugs. He built relationships with them over time, and then he leveraged those relationships into something horrifying. He paid them to bring other boys to him.
How much?
Reports vary, but somewhere between $5 and $10 per victim, sometimes more. He also gave them cars, gifts, status within their peer group. To a teenager with nothing, that is an enormous amount.
And did they understand what was going to happen to the boys they brought?
This is the question that courts and psychologists have wrestled with. Initially, Brooks may not have fully understood, but over time, both boys became aware of what Corll was doing, and they kept bringing victims. By the end, both Brooks and Henley were active participants in the crimes, not just recruiters.
How do you hold that? Like, they were also victimized by this man, and they also participated in harming others.
You hold both truths simultaneously and uncomfortably. The courts held both. Brooks and Henley were both convicted and sentenced to multiple life terms. But the question of how much moral agency a 15-year-old has when they are being manipulated and exploited by a 30-year-old predator, that is not a clean answer.
No, that's not.
What I keep coming back to is that Corll specifically chose teenagers who were already vulnerable. He didn't stumble into two accomplices. He built them. He identified kids the system wasn't protecting and made himself indispensable to them. The victims, at least 28 confirmed, all male, ages ranging from 9 to 20, predominantly from the Houston Heights and surrounding working-class neighborhoods. Many were friends or acquaintances of Brooks and Henley, which is what made the luring so effective. It wasn't a stranger, it was someone they knew.
And their families were reporting them missing.
Repeatedly, desperately, and being ignored. This is the part of this case that I find genuinely enraging, Dylan. The Houston Police Department's response to the missing persons reports from the Heights was, there's no diplomatic way to say this, contemptible.
What were they saying to the families?
The consistent response was some version of, boys run away, boys from this neighborhood especially, they'll turn up, don't worry. And families who pushed back were essentially told they were overreacting.
Working-class families in a declining neighborhood.
Working-class families in a declining neighborhood whose teenage sons were disappearing and who were told by the police that this was just what teenage boys did. The assumption of disposability was baked into the institutional response.
How many reports were filed before Corll was stopped?
Dozens. Individual families filed reports. Some filed multiple times. There was never any serious effort to connect the disappearances or look for a pattern. The boys of the Houston Heights were not considered worth connecting.
That is, I don't have a word strong enough.
The word is a failure. A catastrophic, inexcusable institutional failure, and it cost lives. Corll operated for 3 years. 3 years during which families were screaming into a void.
Let's name some of the victims.
David HILLarious, 13 years old. His family printed flyers. His parents drove around the neighborhood for months. Gregory Malley Winkle, 16. Frank Aguirre, 18. Mark Scott, 17. Reuben Watson Haney, 17. Billy Balch, 17. Johnny Delhomme, 16. Willard Branch, 17. Steve Sickman, 17. And many more, 28 confirmed, and investigators at the time believed the true number might be higher.
28 confirmed and possibly more.
Possibly more. Some investigators believe Corll may have been active before 1970, and that the confirmed count is a floor, not a ceiling.
How does it end? Because Corll didn't get arrested, he didn't get caught by police.
He was shot by Elmer Wayne Henley in the early morning hours of August 8, 1973.
Henley shot him.
Here is what happened. Henley had brought 2 friends to Corll's apartment, a boy named Timothy Curley and a girl named Rhonda Williams. Corll was furious that Henley had brought a girl. He had no interest in female victims. An argument broke out. Corll tied up all 3 teenagers, including Henley. And then, in a version of events that Henley has maintained consistently, Corll untied Henley and told him to assault Curley and Williams while Corll watched.
And Henley refused.
Henley refused. He grabbed Corll's own gun. Corll said, and these were apparently his last words, "Go ahead and shoot me." Henley shot him 6 times.
And then?
And then Henley called the police, and the officer who answered, according to Henley, initially didn't believe him and suggested the kids had just been partying. It took a second call before anyone actually came.
Even the call confessing the murders wasn't taken seriously immediately.
Even then, when police finally arrived and Henley led them to the first burial site, a boat storage shed Corll had rented, they found the remains of 17 victims. They then found more at 2 other sites.
Did the Houston Police Department acknowledge their failure?
Not in any meaningful way at the time. The lieutenant who oversaw the missing persons response was quoted as saying the department had done nothing wrong, that they couldn't have known, which is, given the number of reports filed, a genuinely breathtaking statement.
Breathtaking is the word. Okay, the question I've been sitting with this whole episode. More victims than Gacy, more victims than Bundy. Why is Dean Corll not a household name?
A few reasons, I think, and none of them are flattering. First, his victims were boys. The true crime genre, and this is a genuine critique of the genre we are part of, has historically centered female victims. The cases that become cultural touchstones are overwhelmingly cases where women and girls were killed. Male victims, especially young men and boys from working-class backgrounds, get less coverage, less cultural attention, less narrative weight.
That's a real pattern.
It's a documented pattern. Second, Corll was stopped not by a dramatic police investigation, but by being shot by a teenager. There was no manhunt, no detective closing in, no courtroom drama. He was just dead. And his accomplices confessed. The story doesn't have the narrative arc that makes for compelling TV movies.
And third,
I think the location and the community mattered. The Houston Heights in 1973 was not glamorous. The victims were not from families with the resources or connections to demand coverage. The story wasn't picked up nationally with the same energy as cases involving more visible victims in more visible places.
So it's the same failure twice. First, the police didn't pay attention because of who the victims were. Then the media didn't pay attention for the same reason.
The same failure, yes, amplified.
And we're sitting here in episode 16 talking about it because
these 28 boys deserve to be known. David HILLarious and Gregory Winkle and Frank Aguirre and all the others. They were real people from a real neighborhood with families who loved them and looked for them. The least we can do is say their names.
Dean Corll, the Candyman, at least 28 victims, active from 1970 to 1973, stopped not by law enforcement but by a frightened teenager with a gun. A case that should be in every true crime conversation and largely isn't.
His victims were David HILLarious, Gregory Malley Winkle, Donald Waldrop, Jerry Waldrop, Randall Harvey, David Yates, Frank Aguirre, Mark Scott, Reuben Watson Haney, Billy Balch, Johnny DeLome, Willard Branch, Steve Sickman, Marty Jones, Charles Cobble, Bert Thompson, Roy Bunton, Homer Garcia, Richard Hembry, Wally J. Simoneau, Richard Kepner, James Dreimela, Timothy Cordell, Joseph Lyles, William Ray Lawrence, Raymond Blackburn, Michael Balch, and others whose names we honor today.
we say their names.
We say their names.
If this episode made you think about whose stories get told and whose don't, that's the right reaction. It should make you think about that.
The families of the Houston Heights victims spent years fighting for acknowledgement. Some of them are still fighting. That work matters.
Thank you for being here for episode 16. Subscribe, leave a review. Keep sending us your case suggestions. We read every single one.
I'm Cindy.
I'm Dylan,
Take care of each other out there.
especially the kids in your neighborhood.